Heart failure, it's one of the biggest health challenges we face globally, right? And diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, so much hinges on one single number.
That's right. The left ventricular ejection fraction, or LVEF, it's been the absolute gatekeeper in cardiology for, well, for decades.
Decades. Yeah, as we'll explore today, it often gives us an incomplete picture, sometimes even a misleading one, of what's really going on inside the heart.
Exactly. It's fundamentally limited.
So today, we're diving deep into some fascinating sources. Research that shows LVEF's reign as the undisputed champ might be coming to an end.
Yeah, the landscape is definitely shifting.
Our mission here is to explore how artificial intelligence, AI, and some really cool new sensor tech, seismocardiography, SCG, we'll get into, that are moving heart monitoring forward.
Moving away from that static, volume-based number, LVEF, towards something more dynamic, more precise tracking of the heart muscle itself.
Okay, so why is this shift even necessary? What's the core problem with LVEF?
Well, the thing is, LVEF is sort of an artificial measure. You usually get it from an echocardiogram, an ultrasound of the heart,
Right.
and it measures the change in the heart's cavity volume, how much blood gets squeezed out with each beat. It doesn't directly tell you how well the muscle fibers are contracting.
So it's like judging an engine by how far the gas pedal is pushed down, but not knowing the actual horsepower.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
You're missing the underlying mechanical efficiency, the actual muscle function.
And we've got some really interesting material today. AI models tested on diverse groups, including underserved populations, which is critical.
Absolutely critical for fairness.
We have studies on these wearable heart sensors, seeing if they actually work in a clinical setting.
And even FDA documents showing how regulators are trying to figure out how to handle medical AI that, learns and changes after it's released.
That sounds complicated.
It is. Let's maybe start by digging into why the current gold standard, LVEF, has these shortcomings.
Okay, so clinically, LVEF is huge. If that number drops below a certain point, it triggers major decisions, right?
Absolutely. It determines if a patient needs an implantable defibrillator, an ICD, or, say, when it's time for valve replacement surgery. It really is the guidepost doctors follow.
But you're saying that guidepost can be wrong?
Yeah.
Or at least dangerously late?
It can be dangerously late.
Yeah.
Our sources point out that LVEF can look normal, what we call preserved, maybe above 60%, even while the patient's underlying heart muscle is actually degrading. Irreversible damage could be happening.
Wait, how is that possible? If the muscle is failing, wouldn't the ejection fraction have to drop?
Not necessarily, because the heart compensates. Think of the heart muscle having different layers or fiber types.
Okay.
Early in diseases like, say, severe mitral regurgitation or aortic stenosis, the more sensitive interlongitudinal fibers might start to fail. But the stronger outer circumferential fibers can pick up the slack, compensating for that loss.
So the overall pumping action, the volume squeezed out, stays high, keeping the LVEF number looking good.
Exactly. The global performance is maintained, maybe just hovering above that crucial 50% threshold, while underneath, fibrosis scarring is setting in and the damage is accelerating.
So if someone's LVEF is, say, 55%, current guidelines won't say wait and watch, but the actual structural damage could already be quite severe.
That's precisely the fear. Waiting until LVEF drops below the common 50% cutoff for surgical referral, especially in those valve disease cases, is often just too late. The damage is done.
Wow. And does the LVEF number become less useful even when it's not critically low?
Yes, that's another key point from the sources. The prognostic value, how well LVEF predicts future problems, really reduces significantly once you get above maybe 45%.
Meaning?
Meaning if your LVEF is 30%, that number tells doctors a lot about your risk. But if your LVEF is 50% or 55%, that number becomes much less predictive, potentially more misleading about your true long-term outlook.
Okay, that really sets the stage for needing something better. Which brings us to AI.
Right. If LVEF is vital, but measuring it with echocardiography is expensive, takes time, it needs specialized technicians, it's not accessible everywhere.
Especially not in remote or underserved areas.
Exactly. So the idea is, can we use something cheap and already available everywhere, the standard 12-lead ECG, the electrocardiogram, to estimate the ejection fraction?
That would be a huge accessibility win.
A massive win. And we looked at a study that did just this, testing AI models on ECGs from about 55,500 patients, specifically from the rural Appalachian population.
Why focus specifically on Appalachia? This seems like a deliberate choice.
It was very deliberate. AI fairness is a huge concern.
Yeah.
Most medical AI gets trained on data from big, urban academic medical centers.
Which might not represent everyone.
Precisely. If you take that model and deploy it in a place like rural Appalachia, which unfortunately has very high rates of heart disease, without specifically testing it there, you risk that model performing poorly for the very people who need it most. It could be biased.
So this study was about ensuring that AI works fairly for this specific, often overlooked population.
Exactly. It's about equity and AI validation, making sure the tools work for everyone.
So how did the AI do? When they fed the ECG signals from this Appalachian cohort into different models, which one came out on top for estimating EF?
The best performer was a deep learning model called ResNet. It achieved what's called an AURC score, around 0.86.
Okay, AURC. Break that down for us. What does 0.86 mean?
Sure. AUROC is the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve. Just think of it as a single score summarizing how well the model can tell the difference between patients with low EF, the ones who are sicker, and those with high EF.
And a scale.
It goes from 0.5, which is basically random guessing, like flipping a coin, up to 1.0, which would be perfect prediction. So 0.86 is actually a very strong performance. It shows the model is quite good at distinguishing based on the ECG alone.
Now, the sources mentioned something interesting. ResNet actually did better than some even more complex, newer architectures like transformers. Why would that happen? I thought transformers were state-of-the-art.
They often are, especially for things like language processing. But it's often a trade-off between model complexity and the amount of data you have. Transformers are incredibly complex.
Right.
They need truly massive data sets to learn effectively, to really leverage their internal self-attention mechanisms. While 55,500 patients sounds like a lot, and it probably just wasn't enough data for the transformer to fully optimize and outperform the more established, perhaps more efficient structure of ResNet for this specific task of analyzing ECG signals.
That makes sense. Data size matters. I also saw that ResNet seemed more sensitive. It showed higher variance when the researchers changed the EF cutoff point, like deciding if low EF means below 40% or below 50%. What does that sensitivity tell us?
It suggests the deep learning model, ResNet, is picking up on really subtle, complex patterns in the ECG data that relate to different levels of dysfunction. Simpler models, like maybe an SVM, support vector machine, tend to draw cleaner, more rigid lines. ResNet's higher variance when the threshold shifts suggests it's adapting more fluidly to the nuances in the data at each specific cutoff point. It's capturing more of the underlying biological complexity, even if that makes the boundary seem a bit less stable across different thresholds.
And could they tell what the AI was looking at in the ECG? Did it pinpoint specific parts of the signal?
Yes, and that's crucial for trusting these models. They used interpretability techniques. While the whole 12-lead ECG was needed for best performance, the AI highlighted the QRS complex that's the main spike in the heartbeat signal in specific leads, I, AVR, V2, and V3, as being particularly important indicators of low EF.
So it's not just a black box. It's finding specific electrical signals related to poor pumping function.
Exactly. We're essentially substituting that volumetric measure from the echo with direct electrical evidence of muscle impairment, just by cleverly combining data from the standard ECG leads.
Incredible. But AI isn't just about taking a snapshot, right? The sources also talk about using electronic health records, EHR data, to predict how EF might change over time.
Yes. Moving from diagnosis to prognosis, predicting the future trajectory. This is so important for managing chronic heart failure.
Tell me about that study.
It was a multi-center study using EHR data, things like past diagnoses, labs, demographics, to predict whether a patient's EF was likely to increase, decrease, or stay stable over the next year.
And which AI model worked best for that kind of prediction?
For this task, across 3 major academic hospitals, a model called XGBoost consistently came out on top.
XGBoost. Okay. And did it find it easier to predict things getting better or things getting worse?
Interestingly, the models, especially XGBoost, performed with higher confidence and accuracy when predicting an increase in EFSO, predicting recovery or improvement compared to predicting a decrease.
Huh. Any idea why?
It's hard to say definitively, but perhaps the patterns or factors leading to improvement are just more clearly represented or consistent in the available EHR data than the diverse pathways leading to decline.
Makes sense. And what kind of factors in the patient's record were most predictive of these future changes?
XGBoost pointed to a mix, really. The patient starting EF was key, obviously, but also things like gender, having other heart diseases, COPD, valve problems, race, and diabetes status were all significant predictors.
So it really underscores the power of combining that baseline measurement with a patient's broader clinical history.
Absolutely. It builds a much more holistic picture to forecast future cardiac health.
Okay, but what if we could bypass LVEF altogether? Not just estimate it better, but measure something more fundamental, more dynamic in real time.
Now you're talking about the next frontier.
Yeah.
And that brings us to wearable sensors, specifically seismocardiography (SCG).
Seismocardiography. Sounds complex.
The name has maybe been intimidating, but the concept is elegant. Instead of imaging, SCG uses a small patch, basically an accelerometer, worn on the chest.
Like the motion sensor in your phone?
Pretty much, yeah. A sensitive one. It measures the tiny mechanical vibrations produced by your heart beating, the muscle contracting, the valves closing.
Okay, measuring vibrations. What's the goal? What are they trying to detect?
The main goal here is to detect acute hemodynamic congestion before it becomes clinically obvious. Congestion is fluid buildup due to the heart not pumping effectively. It often precedes worsening heart failure symptoms by days or even weeks.
So instead of waiting for the EF number to drop or the patient to feel short of breath, you're looking for the early signs of pressure building up inside the circulatory system.
Exactly. You're trying to catch the problem upstream. Specifically, tracking changes in pressures inside the heart and lungs, primarily the pulmonary artery mean pressure, PM, and the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, PCWP.
And how do they know if a chest patch can accurately reflect those internal pressures?
That's where the clinical validation comes in. We looked at a feasibility study where heart failure patients wore an SCG patch while also undergoing right heart catheterization, or RHC.
RHT, that's the invasive gold standard, right? Where they thread a catheter into the heart to measure pressures directly.
Precisely. So they had the direct invasive pressure measurements and the non-invasive SCG vibration data from the patch simultaneously, a direct comparison.
Okay. And how did they connect the vibrations to the pressure numbers? What was the AI doing?
They used a machine learning technique called support vector regression, SVR. Unlike classification models that predict categories like high-low EF, regression models predict a continuous number, in this case, the pressure reading.
And what features did they feed into this SVR model?
They derived features based on something called dynamic time warping, or DTW. DTW is basically a clever algorithm that compares the shape of two time series signals, even if they're slightly stretched or contrast in time.
So it compared the shape of the patient's current SCG heartbeat signal to, say, a baseline signal recorded earlier.
Exactly. They look at the DTW distance, how different the heartbeat shape was between a baseline reading and readings taken after giving the patient a vasodilator medication, which changes the pressures. The SVR model learned how those changes in vibration shape correlated with the actual pressure changes measured by the RHC.
Did it work? Could they link specific parts of the vibration signal to specific pressures?
Yes, and the findings were physiologically really interesting. Changes in the SCG signal during the ventricular systolic portion of the heartbeat, that's when the main pumping chambers contract.
Right, ventricle pushing blood to the lungs.
Provided the most information about changes in PAM, the pressure in the pulmonary artery. It makes sense, right?
Yeah, that tracks.
And conversely, changes in the SCG signal during atrial systole, which corresponds to the active diastolic filling phase of the ventricles.
When the atria push blood into the ventricles.
That part of the signal provided the most information about changes in PCWP, the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, which reflects pressure building up back from the left side of the heart.
Wow, so the vibrations aren't just noise. Specific parts of the heartbeat's mechanical signature directly map onto specific pressures in different parts of the heart and lung circulation.
It really validates SCG as a potential tool for non-invasively tracking these critical hemodynamic pressures in real time.
This shift towards dynamic, real-time pressure monitoring, it feels like the future. But getting these technologies into widespread use, that involves hurdles, right? Regulatory, ethical hurdles.
Huge hurdles, absolutely. And first, just technically analyzing this continuous stream of data from wearables like SCG patches requires pretty sophisticated AI.
More complex than the ECG models.
Often, yes. You're dealing with long sequences of complex, noisy, non-linear data. Basic recurrent neural networks, RNNs, might be a starting point, but often you need more advanced versions like LSTM or GRU models.
LSTM, GRU. What makes them different?
They have internal mechanisms, often called gates, that allow them to selectively remember or forget information over long periods. They have better long-term memory, which is crucial when you're analyzing heartbeat data stretching over potentially hours, days, or months to find subtle trends.
Okay, so the AI tech is complex. What about the ethical side? We touched on testing in diverse groups, but the sources also mentioned a digital divide.
Yes, and this is a really serious concern with wearable tech. The data clearly shows that people with higher household incomes are significantly more likely to buy and use wearable health devices.
So if the best, most predictive heart monitoring, like this SCG tech that could catch failure weeks early, relies on a device that costs, hundreds of dollars, plus maybe a subscription.
Then you risk creating a two-tiered system. You could actually automate and worsen health inequalities based purely on who can afford the latest monitoring technology.
That puts enormous pressure on regulators like the FDA. Their traditional approach was built for static things, right? A drug that doesn't change, a medical device with fixed code.
Exactly. The old paradigm was you test a device or software, it gets approved, and it stays locked in that approved state. Maybe minor bug fixes, but the core function doesn't change.
But these new AML system software as a medical device, or SAM&D, are designed to learn and adapt from new data they see in the real world. That breaks the old model.
Completely. You can't require a full re-review every time the algorithm learns something new and updates itself slightly. That would stifle the very innovation that makes these tools powerful.
Yeah.
But you also can't just let them change uncontrollably.
So what's the FDA's proposed solution? How do you regulate software that's supposed to improve itself while it's being used on patients?
They're developing what they call the Total Product Life Cycle, TPLC, approach. The core idea is that manufacturers, when they first submit the AI software for approval, also have to submit a detailed plan.
A plan for what?
A plan for how the algorithm is expected to change after it's deployed. It's called an Algorithm Change Protocol, or ACP. This protocol basically lays out the guardrails, the types of modifications the algorithm is allowed to make, the data sources it can learn from, how performance will be monitored.
Ah, okay. So the FDA isn't approving the final algorithm, but rather the process by which the algorithm will be allowed to evolve within predefined boundaries.
That's a good way to put it. If the manufacturer follows their pre-approved ACP and the changes stay within those specified guardrails, the software can be updated in the field without needing a brand new FDA submission every single time.
That sounds like a pragmatic compromise.
It tries to be. It shifts the focus to the manufacturer, having really strong internal processes, being transparent about changes, and committing to continuous real-world performance monitoring to ensure the AI stays safe and effective as it learns.
This has been, well, a really eye-opening deep dive. We started with LVEF, the cornerstone measurement.
And established that it's fundamentally flawed because it's measuring volume changes, not muscle function directly, and can be dangerously late.
Then we saw technology stepping in. First, AI like ResNet making EF estimation accessible using just the standard ECG, crucially validated in underserved groups like in Appalachia.
Democratizing that first step. And second, moving potentially beyond EF entirely with wearable SCG sensors, using vibrations to track actual hemodynamic pressures, catching congestion potentially weeks before a crisis.
It really feels like a shift from static snapshots of the heart to this continuous, personalized, predictive tracking of cardiovascular health.
I think the most profound advancement here is how these technologies, AI analyzing ECGs, SCG sensors, are making complex physiological data that used to require invasive procedures or expensive imaging, potentially accessible almost anywhere, maybe even just from a patch on your chest.
But it leaves us with that tricky regulatory, even philosophical question at the end, doesn't it?
It really does. This TPLC approach, the ACP, it's necessary to allow AI to improve. But if these medical devices are designed to constantly learn and optimize themselves after they're out in the world based on real patient data, how much change is okay?
Right. If an update happens within the pre-approved plan, it doesn't need immediate re-review. But at what point does continuous adaptation, this constant improvement, start to undermine the need for a stable, reliable, understandable diagnostic standard that both doctors and you, the patient, can actually trust? Where's that line?